Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom floor, wine dripping from the hem of her dress, and 300 pairs of eyes were fixed on her. Somewhere behind her, a woman laughed so loudly it echoed off the marble columns. Eleanor did not move. She did not run. She simply stood there, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks, and waited to see what would happen next. It had not always been like this. 2 years earlier, Eleanor's father had been alive, and the house on Corin Lane had been warm with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had been a merchant of modest means but enormous kindness, a man who believed that character mattered more than coin. When he married Margaret Ashworth 3 years before his death, Eleanor had hoped for a mother again. She had been 8 years old when her own mother died of fever, and she had spent her childhood quietly aching for someone to braid her hair and tell her she was loved. Margaret was not that person. From the very first week, Margaret made her preferences clear. Her own daughters, Cordelia and Beatrice, were dressed in silk and given piano lessons. Eleanor was given chores. When Edmund asked why, Margaret always had a soft answer ready, something about Eleanor being the practical one, or not needing such fuss. Edmund, a trusting man, believed her, and Eleanor learned quickly not to complain, because complaining only made things worse when her father was not looking. Then 2 winters ago, Edmund caught a fever after helping a stranger whose carriage had overturned on the icy road outside town. He never fully recovered his strength, and within a month, he was gone. Eleanor was left with a stepmother who no longer needed to pretend, and 2 stepsisters who had learned cruelty from watching their mother practice it. Now, at 19, Eleanor rose before dawn to light the fires, scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked, and mended clothes by candlelight after everyone else had gone to bed. She rarely left the house except to fetch bread or thread. The world outside Corin Lane had become a distant memory, something she used to belong to. So when the invitation arrived from Ashford Hall, sealed with a crest of a silver hawk, Eleanor nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. "The Duke's ball," Margaret said, holding the card up to the light with something close to reverence. "Every family of standing will be there. This is exactly the sort of evening that could change everything for Cordelia." "And for me?" Beatrice asked, pouting slightly. "For both of you," Margaret said quickly, though her eyes lingered longer on Cordelia, the elder and, in Margaret's opinion, the more marriageable of the 2. Eleanor kept her head down and continued setting the table, expecting no mention of herself at all. She had attended exactly 1 social event since her father's death, a small tea 2 summers ago, and even that had ended with Margaret finding a reason to send her home early. "Eleanor will come as well," Margaret said suddenly. Eleanor's hands stilled on the tablecloth. She looked up, searching her stepmother's face for some sign of warmth, some flicker of the woman who had once, in rare unguarded moments, called her dear. She found nothing but a smile that did not reach the eyes. "Truly?" Eleanor asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Of course," Margaret said. "You are part of this family, are you not? It would look strange if you were left behind." Cordelia and Beatrice exchanged a glance across the table, a quick, knowing look that Eleanor did not understand, but that made her stomach tighten all the same. She had learned over the years to read the small signals in that house, the tilts of eyebrows and pressed lips that meant something was being planned. But she could not guess what this one meant, and for a moment, hope outweighed caution. Perhaps, she thought, this was Margaret's way of finally including her. Perhaps enough time had passed that old wounds could soften. Eleanor allowed herself, just for that evening, to imagine walking into a grand hall, wearing something lovely, feeling for one night like the girl she used to be before grief and grinding work had worn her down. She should have known better. The days that followed were filled with a flurry of preparation. Seamstresses came and went from the house, carrying bolts of fine blue silk for Cordelia and soft rose satin for Beatrice. Eleanor watched from the doorway of the sitting room, careful not to be seen watching for too long, as the 2 sisters were fitted and turned and admired in the mirror. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she was used to being overlooked. On the 4th day, Margaret called her into the study. "I have not forgotten you," Margaret said, gesturing to a paper-wrapped parcel on the desk. I had something made for you as well." Alina's heart lifted despite everything she had learned to expect. She stepped forward and carefully unwrapped the parcel, her fingers trembling slightly with an emotion she barely recognized in herself anymore. Hope. Inside was a dress the color of overripe mustard, stiff and heavy, cut in a style that had gone out of fashion years before. The waist was pinched strangely high, the sleeves puffed in a way that made the shoulders look absurd, and near the hem, clearly visible even before it was worn, there was a patch of fabric sewn on with careless, uneven stitches, as though someone had torn the dress and repaired it badly on purpose. Alina stared at it for a long moment, unable to speak. "Well," Margaret said, watching her closely, "do you like it?" "It is very kind of you," Alina managed, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I had it made specially," Margaret said, and there was something in her tone, something almost too pleased, that made Alina's stomach twist with unease. "You will stand out at the ball, I am sure of it." Later that evening, Alina sat alone in her small room at the top of the house, the dress laid across her narrow bed like an accusation. She ran her fingers over the uneven patch near the hem and felt something cold settle in her chest. She was not foolish. She understood in that moment exactly what Margaret intended. This was not an invitation. It was a trap, carefully wrapped in paper and ribbon and false kindness. She thought about refusing to attend. She thought about pleading illness, locking her door, letting Cordelia and Beatrice have their evening of triumph without a target to laugh at. It would have been the easier choice, certainly the safer one. No one would question it. No one would even notice her absence, not really, except perhaps to feel relieved that she would not embarrass the family name. But as she sat there in the candlelight, staring at the dress, she found herself thinking of her father instead. She thought of the way he used to sit beside her bed when she was small and frightened of the dark, telling her that fear was only ever as large as the space you gave it. She thought of her mother, whom she barely remembered except in fragments, a soft voice, a warm hand, a small silver brooch shaped like a bird that had been placed in Alina's palm on the day her mother died, with the words, "This was hers and now it is yours. Wear it when you need to remember who you are." Alina rose from the bed and crossed to the small wooden chest in the corner of her room, the only piece of furniture that had truly belonged to her before Margaret's arrival. Inside, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, was the brooch. She had not worn it in years, afraid that Margaret would take it from her the way she had taken so much else, quietly and without explanation. She held it now in her palm, feeling the cool metal against her skin, tracing the delicate lines of the bird's wings with her thumb. "Dignity is not in what you wear," her mother's voice seemed to whisper from somewhere deep in memory, "but in how you carry it." Alina did not know in that moment whether the words were a true memory or something she had built for herself over the years, a comfort stitched together from longing. It did not matter. The words steadied her all the same. She would go to the ball. She would wear the ugly dress, because refusing to attend would be its own kind of surrender, a quiet admission that Margaret's cruelty had won without a fight. But she would not go as a victim. She would pin her mother's brooch above her heart, and she would walk into that ballroom with her head held high, whatever anyone chose to say about her. She did not yet know what waited for her there. She did not know that across town, in the grand halls of Ashford House, a young duke named Alexander was dreading the very same evening for reasons entirely his own, reasons that would, within a matter of hours, become tangled with hers in ways neither of them could have imagined. She only knew, sitting alone in her small room with her mother's brooch warm in her hand, that she was done being small. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it standing tall. Outside her window, the last light of evening faded over the rooftops of the city, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of the cathedral rang out the hour, counting down, though she did not know it yet, to the night that would change everything. The morning of the ball arrived gray and cold, though no one in the Whitmore household seemed to notice the weather. The house buzzed with activity from sunrise, maids rushing up and down the stairs with curling irons and ribbons, Cordelia calling out for someone to fetch her pearl combs, Beatrice arguing with a seamstress over the exact shade of pink she wanted for her sash. Alina moved through the chaos quietly, carrying pitchers of hot water and pressing gowns that were not her own, and no one thought to ask whether she needed help preparing for the very same event. She did not mind, not really. She had grown used to being invisible in her own home, and there was, strangely, a kind of freedom in it. No one watched her closely enough to notice what she did in the quiet corners of the day. In the late afternoon, when the house had finally settled into a lull between fittings, Alina slipped up to her small room and closed the door. The mustard-colored dress hung from a hook on the wall, and in the fading light it looked even worse than she remembered, the color dull and sickly, the shape all wrong for her slender frame. She had thought, in the days since Margaret gave it to her, about ways to fix it. She had no money for new fabric and no time to have anything properly altered, but she had her own 2 hands, and she had learned to sew out of necessity years ago. She could not change the color, she could not change the strange, old-fashioned cut, but she could, perhaps, change how it sat on her. Using a length of dark green ribbon left over from an old bonnet, Alina fashioned a narrow sash to wrap around the high, awkward waistline, drawing it in slightly and giving the dress at least the suggestion of a proper shape. She carefully unpicked the worst of the puffed sleeves and restitched them flatter, so they no longer stood out so absurdly from her shoulders. The uneven patch near the hem she could not remove without leaving a hole, so instead she embroidered a small, simple line of leaves around it with green thread, turning the crude repair into something that at least looked intentional, even pretty, if one did not look too closely. It was not a transformation. The dress was still plain, still out of fashion, still nothing like the silk gowns her stepsisters would wear. But it was, at last, something she had made her own, rather than something done to her. When the hour came to dress, Alina did so alone, without a maid to help with her hair or laces, exactly as she had expected. She twisted her dark hair into a simple knot at the back of her neck, secured with 2 plain pins, and studied herself for a long moment in the small, spotted mirror above her washstand. The face that looked back at her was thin from years of hard work and thin meals, but her eyes, she thought, still held something of her mother in them, a quiet steadiness that no amount of cruelty had managed to erase. She reached for the small silver brooch, still wrapped in its handkerchief, and pinned it carefully just above her heart, exactly where her mother had once worn it. The bird's wings caught the last of the candlelight, and for a moment Alina felt less alone. Downstairs the carriage was waiting. Margaret took one look at Alina descending the staircase, and her lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How lovely," Margaret said smoothly, though the tone carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Come along, we mustn't keep the Duke waiting." Cordelia, resplendent in blue silk with her hair elaborately curled, glanced at Alina and let out a soft, delighted laugh, quickly covering her mouth as though she had not meant to be heard. Beatrice, in her rose satin, simply stared wide-eyed before dissolving into quiet giggles of her own. Alina said nothing. She lifted her chin and walked past them to the waiting carriage, refusing to let either of them see how the laughter landed. The ride to Ashford Hall took nearly an hour, winding through the darkening city and out along a broad avenue lined with tall trees, whose branches met overhead like the arches of a cathedral. Alina watched the passing lanterns through the carriage window, half listening as Margaret coached her daughters on which families to greet first, which young gentlemen held the best prospects, which topics of conversation to avoid. No one spoke to Alina at all during the journey, and she found she preferred it that way. She needed the silence to steady her nerves, to remind herself, again and again, of the words she had chosen to carry with her that night. Dignity is not in what you wear, but in how you carry it. She did not yet know that, in a grand house at the end of that avenue, a young man was pacing the length of his study with far less composure than she was managing to hold on to herself. Alexander, Duke of Ashford, had never wanted this ball. It had been his aunt's idea, insisted upon after months of gentle and then increasingly firm pressure for him to finally choose a bride and secure the family line. At 26, he was considered, by the standards of society, dangerously close to being a permanent bachelor, a fate his aunt viewed as something between a tragedy and a personal insult. "You cannot hide in this house forever, Alexander," she had told him just that morning, standing in the doorway of his study with her arms crossed. "Your father would be ashamed to see you avoiding your duty." Alexander had said nothing in response, though the words stung more than he cared to admit. His father had died 5 years ago, and in the years since, Alexander had thrown himself into managing the estate, the tenant farms, the family's various holdings, anything that kept his hands and mind occupied. Society events, with their endless performances of politeness and their transparent hunt for advantageous matches, had never held any appeal for him. He found most conversation at such gatherings shallow. Most young women coached so thoroughly by their mothers that he could never tell whether he was speaking to a person or a rehearsed set of pleasant phrases. Still, he understood his aunt was not entirely wrong. The estate needed an heir eventually, and he could not avoid society forever. So he had agreed to host the ball, if only to satisfy the demands placed upon him, with no real expectation that the evening would bring anything other than the usual tedium. He dressed that evening without enthusiasm, adjusting his cravat in the mirror with the distracted air of a man preparing for a task he had no interest in completing. As he made his way down to the receiving line, he found himself thinking, as he often did in quiet moments, of the man who had saved his life many years before. He had been barely 21 at the time, riding home late one winter evening when his carriage struck a patch of ice and overturned on a steep stretch of road. He remembered little of the accident itself, only the sound of splintering wood and the terrible, weightless moment of the carriage rolling. He remembered waking to find a stranger pulling him free from the wreckage, a merchant traveling the same road, who had stopped without hesitation despite the danger to himself. The man had refused any reward. Alexander remembered his exact words, spoken with quiet conviction as he helped Alexander to his feet. "Be kind to those the world overlooks, and consider your debt paid in full." Alexander had never learned the man's name. In the chaos following the accident, in his own injury and the arrival of his household's men, the merchant had slipped away before proper introductions could be made. Alexander had tried in the years since to track him down, sending inquiries through the towns along that road, but nothing had ever come of it. The man remained, in Alexander's memory, a figure of quiet grace whose words he had carried with him ever since, a private compass he consulted whenever the demands of his title threatened to make him forget the person he wanted to be. He thought of those words now, standing at the top of the grand staircase as the first carriages began arriving, their lanterns bobbing up the long drive like a string of golden beads. Be kind to those the world overlooks. It was strange, he thought, how a single sentence from a stranger could shape a man more than years of formal instruction. The ballroom, when the doors were finally opened, was a vision of candlelight and polished marble, the walls hung with pale silk and garlands of white flowers, an orchestra tuning quietly in the corner beneath a row of tall windows. Guests poured in over the following hour, a shifting sea of silk and jewels, laughter and music rising together into the vaulted ceiling. Alina arrived with the rest of her family just past 8 o'clock, and as the carriage rolled to a stop at the base of the grand steps, she felt her heart begin to pound in a way it had not done in years. Through the tall windows, she could see the golden glow of the ballroom, hear the faint strains of music drifting out into the cold night air, and for one unguarded moment, standing there in her mustard-colored dress with her mother's brooch pinned above her heart, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. Margaret's hand closed briefly around her wrist as they climbed the steps together, not out of affection. Alina understood immediately, but out of the need to ensure she did not somehow slip away before her role in the evening's plan could play out. "Remember," Margaret murmured, low enough that only Alina could hear, "you are here as our guest tonight. Try not to embarrass the family." Alina said nothing. She simply lifted her chin a fraction higher and walked through the grand doors into the blazing light of the ballroom beyond, her mother's words steady in her chest like a second heartbeat, unaware that on the far side of that glittering room, a young duke who had spent years searching for a debt he could never properly repay was about to see, for the very first time, the face of the man who had once saved his life, reflected unmistakably in the quiet dignity of his daughter. The ballroom swallowed Alina whole the moment she stepped through the doors. A wash of candlelight and perfume, and the low hum of hundreds of conversations layered over the sweet strains of a string quartet. She had forgotten, in her years of quiet confinement at Corin Lane, how overwhelming a crowd of this size could feel, how many eyes there were to catch and hold and judge in a single glance. Margaret released her wrist almost immediately upon entering, moving swiftly toward a cluster of well-dressed matrons near the refreshment table, already deep in the business of securing introductions for Cordelia. Beatrice trailed after her mother and sister, casting one last amused glance back at Alina before disappearing into the crowd. Alina stood alone near the entrance for a long moment, unsure where to place herself. She had no acquaintances here, no one to greet her, no mother to guide her through the delicate choreography of a grand ball. She had attended so few gatherings like this that the etiquette felt like a language she had once known and mostly forgotten. She noticed almost immediately the first flicker of attention turning her way. A young woman in lavender silk, standing near one of the tall windows, leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind a fan, her eyes flicking briefly toward Alina's dress before both women dissolved into quiet, poorly hidden laughter. Alina felt the heat rise in her cheeks but forced herself to keep walking, choosing a spot near one of the long windows where she could stand somewhat apart from the thickest part of the crowd. It was not the last such glance. As the evening wore on, Alina became increasingly aware of the pattern repeating itself around the room, small groups pausing their conversation as she passed, eyes traveling from her face down to the strange, dated cut of her dress, mouths curving into smiles that were not kind. She kept her expression carefully neutral, her shoulders back, her chin level, exactly as she had promised herself she would. It was harder than she had expected. Each glance, each whisper, landed like a small stone against her composure, and by the time an hour had passed, she felt as though she were carrying an invisible weight across her shoulders, heavier with every passing minute. She found a measure of relief near the edge of the room, where an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes stood observing the dancers with quiet amusement. The woman glanced over as Alina approached and offered a small, genuine smile, the first Alina had received all evening. "You are not dancing," the woman observed. "I do not know many people here," Alina admitted. "Nor do half the young women in this room, though you would not guess it from how loudly they laugh with one another," the woman said, and there was a dryness to her tone that surprised Alina into a small, unexpected smile of her own. "I am Lady Prescott, and you are?" "Alina Whitmore." "Whitmore," Lady Prescott repeated, studying her with sudden interest. "Any relation to Edmund Whitmore, the merchant?" Alina's breath caught slightly. It had been so long since anyone outside her immediate family had spoken her father's name that hearing it now, spoken with something like respect, struck her with unexpected force. "He was my father," Alina said. "He passed 2 years ago." Lady Prescott's expression softened. "I am sorry to hear it. I knew him only slightly, through my late husband's business dealings, but he was well regarded. A rare thing, in trade circles, to find a man so widely trusted." Alina did not know how to respond to such unexpected kindness. She managed only a quiet thank you, blinking back an unexpected sting of tears, before Lady Prescott was called away by an acquaintance, leaving Alina once again standing alone at the edge of the room, though somehow feeling less invisible than before. Across the ballroom, unnoticed by Alina, Duke Alexander had spent the better part of an hour enduring a slow procession of introductions, each mother steering her daughter toward him with barely disguised eagerness, each young woman offering some variation of the same practiced curtsy and rehearsed compliment. He answered politely, danced when required, and found his attention drifting again and again toward the tall windows near the edge of the room, where he had noticed, almost by accident, a young woman standing apart from the crowd in an old-fashioned dress the color of ripe wheat. There was something in the way she held herself that caught his attention and refused to release it, a stillness that seemed deliberate rather than shy, as though she were holding herself upright through sheer force of will. He watched her for a long moment before his aunt appeared at his elbow, steering him toward yet another introduction, and by the time he was free again, the young woman had moved and he had lost sight of her in the crowd. Near the refreshment table, Cordelia had positioned herself carefully within view of the Duke's usual path around the room, laughing a touch too loudly at whatever her current companion said, glancing frequently toward the doorway to check whether he had noticed her yet. Beatrice, growing bored of standing beside her sister, had wandered off in search of her own entertainment, and it was in this drifting, restless state that she found Alina once more near the windows. "There you are," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I was beginning to think you had found a dark corner to hide in all evening." "I am simply enjoying the music," Alina said evenly. Beatrice's eyes traveled deliberately over Alina's dress, lingering on the embroidered patch near the hem. "How resourceful of you to make such improvements, though I doubt a bit of thread can fix what was already beyond saving." Alina said nothing, refusing to give her stepsister the reaction she was so plainly fishing for. Beatrice's smile faltered slightly at the lack of response, and she glanced around the room, clearly searching for a better audience for her cruelty. She found one a moment later, in the form of Cordelia, who had abandoned her post near the Duke's path and drifted over, drawn by curiosity or boredom or simply the desire to be included in whatever amusement her sister had found. "Look at her," Beatrice murmured to Cordelia, just loud enough for Alina to hear. "Standing here as though she belongs among people of quality." "Mother did say to keep an eye on her," Cordelia replied, her voice pitched to Carrie, drawing the attention of a small cluster of young women nearby who turned, curious, toward the exchange. "We would not want her wandering off and causing a scene, would we, in that dress?" The laughter that followed was quiet at first, contained within their small circle, but Alina felt it settle over her like a physical weight all the same. She kept her eyes forward, focused on a point somewhere beyond the dancers, and reminded herself, silently, of her mother's words. "Dignity is not in what you wear, but in how you carry it." She thought for a moment of simply walking away, finding some quiet corridor where she might catch her breath away from watching eyes. But something in her refused to retreat, some stubborn, quiet strength she had not known she possessed until that very evening, and instead she remained exactly where she stood, her chin level, her shoulders steady, refusing to give her stepsisters the satisfaction of watching her flee. It was Cordelia, growing bolder in the face of Alina's silence, who finally reached for a glass of red wine from a passing servant's tray, holding it with exaggerated carelessness as she stepped closer, still speaking to the small audience that had gathered around them. "I do wonder," Cordelia said, loud enough now that heads throughout the immediate area began to turn, "whether that patch on the hem was meant to be decorative, or whether someone simply ran out of proper fabric halfway through making it." The gathered onlookers laughed again, louder this time, and Alina felt her composure begin to crack at the edges, a hot, humiliated flush spreading up her neck despite every effort to remain calm. She opened her mouth to speak, though she barely knew what words might come, when Cordelia, in a motion that appeared almost too deliberate to be an accident, shifted the glass in her hand and let a measure of red wine slosh over the rim, splashing across the hem of Alina's dress and onto the polished floor beneath her feet. A ripple of shocked laughter spread outward through the nearby crowd, some guests gasping in surprise, others already dissolving into open amusement at the sight. Alina looked down at the dark stain spreading across the mustard fabric, at the wine pooling near her slippers, and felt the entire ballroom seem to tilt slightly around her, the music and conversation blurring into a single roar of humiliation. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Cordelia said, her voice carrying no genuine apology at all, only barely restrained delight. Alina did not move. She could not in that moment find the strength to do anything but stand perfectly still, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, her eyes fixed on the ruined hem of her dress, aware, with a growing and terrible clarity, that nearly every eye in the vast ballroom had now turned toward her, that the orchestra itself seemed to falter for a single, suspended beat, the violins trailing off into an uncertain hush. It was, she realized dimly, exactly the moment Margaret had orchestrated from the very beginning, the culmination of weeks of careful, quiet cruelty, dressed up as generosity and delivered with a smile. Somewhere across the room, though Alina could not see her in that moment, Margaret stood watching with an expression of carefully contained triumph, certain that her plan had unfolded exactly as intended. Alina felt the sting of tears building behind her eyes and fought them back with everything she had left, refusing to let this room, full of strangers who knew nothing of her, see her break. She lifted her chin, though it took every remaining ounce of strength she possessed, and reached instinctively for the small silver brooch pinned above her heart, her fingers finding the familiar shape of the bird's wings beneath the fabric of her dress. Dignity is not in what you wear, but in how you carry it. She did not yet know that from the far side of the ballroom, a pair of dark eyes had fixed on the scene the moment the laughter first began to rise, watching not with amusement but with a slow, dawning recognition, as though some long-buried memory had suddenly surfaced, sharp and unmistakable, at the sight of the small silver bird catching the candlelight against the humiliated young woman's chest. The music had not yet resumed when the crowd near the tall windows began, quite suddenly, to part. It happened in stages, first a few guests near the edge of the gathering stepping aside, then more, then a wider ripple spreading outward through the room as people turned to see what had caused the sudden shift, until finally a clear path opened directly through the center of the ballroom, leading straight from the grand staircase to the spot where Alina stood frozen beside the spreading wine stain. Duke Alexander walked that path without hesitation, his expression unreadable, his pace unhurried but purposeful, the kind of walk that commanded attention without asking for it. Whispers followed him as he moved, a low current of confusion rippling through the guests who could not imagine what business the Duke of Ashford might have with the young woman in the outdated, wine-stained dress standing so awkwardly near the windows. Cordelia's triumphant smile faltered the moment she realized where his path was leading. She glanced quickly toward her mother, seeking some guidance, but Margaret, too, had gone very still, her earlier expression of quiet satisfaction replaced by something closer to alarm as she watched the Duke close the distance toward her stepdaughter. Alina herself had not noticed the parting crowd until he was nearly upon her, so consumed was she with the effort of holding herself together. It was only when the murmuring around her shifted in tone, from mocking amusement to something more like startled curiosity, that she finally lifted her eyes and saw him approaching, tall and composed, his dark coat immaculate, his expression giving away nothing of what he intended. For one terrible, suspended moment, Alina feared, he was coming to add his own judgment to the evening's humiliation, perhaps to ask her, politely but firmly, to leave before she embarrassed his household any further. She braced herself for it, her chin lifting instinctively even as her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Instead, the Duke stopped directly before her and bowed, deeply and formally, exactly as he might have bowed to the most honored guest in the room. A hush fell over the nearby guests, so complete that Alina could hear the faint crackle of the candles burning in their sconces along the wall. "Forgive my delay in greeting you properly," Alexander said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence, pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I was told the most graceful woman in this room would be here tonight. I see now that they were entirely correct." Alina stared at him, certain for a moment that she had misheard, that the roar of humiliation still ringing faintly in her ears had somehow distorted his words into something they could not possibly be. The wine stain was still visible on her dress. The laughter had only just begun to fade. And yet here stood the Duke of Ashford, looking at her as though she were the finest thing in the entire glittering room. "Your Grace," she managed finally, dropping into a curtsy on legs that felt unsteady beneath her, "I believe there has been some mistake." "I do not believe there has," Alexander said quietly, and something in his tone, gentle but entirely certain, made Alina look up and meet his eyes directly for the first time. Whatever she saw there, some quiet warmth beneath the composed formality, steadied her more than she would have expected. Might I have this dance? The question landed like a small explosion across the ballroom. Alina heard the sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, heard the rapid, whispered exchange of at least a dozen conversations breaking out simultaneously as guests turned to their neighbors in open astonishment. The first dance of any grand ball was no small honor. Every mother in that room had spent the evening maneuvering her own daughter into position for precisely this moment. And now the Duke stood offering it, without hesitation, to the young woman the entire room had, only moments before, been laughing at. Alina glanced down at her ruined dress, painfully aware of how she must look, standing there with wine soaking into the mustard fabric, her hair simple and unadorned, nothing like the elegant coiffures and silk gowns surrounding her. "Your Grace, I could not possibly," she began, though even as she spoke the words, some part of her recognized how absurd they sounded, refusing an honor that other women in that very room would have given nearly anything to receive. "Please," Alexander said, and there was something almost urgent in the single word, as though the request meant more to him than simple politeness. "I would consider it a great favor." Alina looked up at him again, searching his face for some hint of pity or mockery, some sign that this was merely an elaborate cruelty of a different kind. She found none. What she found instead was a quiet steadiness that reminded her, unexpectedly and powerfully, of her own father, the same unhurried certainty he had always carried, as though he had already decided what was right and saw no need to explain himself further. Slowly she placed her hand in his. The moment their hands touched, the orchestra, as though released from some invisible hold, began to play again, a soft and stately waltz filling the sudden silence with music. Alexander led her toward the center of the floor, the crowd drawing back further to give them space, and Alina felt, for the first time all evening, the weight of every watching eye shift from mockery into something closer to fascination. They began to dance, and though Alina's steps were uncertain at first, her body still trembling faintly from the humiliation only moments behind her, Alexander guided her with a steady, unhurried patience that gradually eased the tension from her shoulders. She was acutely aware of every eye still fixed upon them, of Cordelia and Beatrice standing frozen near the refreshment table, of Margaret's face, pale and furious, watching from across the room. "You need not look so troubled," Alexander said quietly, his voice pitched only for her. "The dance is nearly finished, and I do not believe anyone in this room is thinking of wine stains any longer." Alina allowed herself a small, surprised laugh, the first genuine sound of amusement she had made all evening. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I find that difficult to believe." "Then believe this instead," he said. "In a year, no one will remember the color of your dress, but I do not believe I will ever forget the way you stood there and refused to let this room see you break." Alina's breath caught slightly at the words, at the quiet sincerity behind them, so different from anything she had expected to hear that evening. She did not know how to respond, and so she said nothing at all, simply allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to be led rather than left standing alone. As the dance continued, Alexander found himself studying her more closely, drawn again and again to the small silver brooch pinned above her heart, the bird's wings catching the candlelight with each turn. Something about it tugged at a memory he could not quite place, a familiarity that seemed to reach back further than the evening itself, though he could not, in the midst of the dance, fully account for the feeling. "That is a lovely piece," he said finally, nodding slightly toward the brooch. "May I ask where it came from?" Alina's hand rose instinctively to touch it, a gesture so familiar it had become almost unconscious. "It belonged to my mother," she said. "She passed when I was young. It is the only thing of hers I truly have left." "Your mother," Alexander repeated slowly, something shifting behind his eyes, a memory stirring that he could not yet fully grasp. "And your father, might I ask his name?" "Edmund Whitmore," Alina said, watching curiously as the Duke's expression changed, something crossing his features that looked unmistakably like recognition. The music swelled around them, the final notes of the waltz beginning to build toward their close, and across the room, unnoticed by either of them in that suspended moment, Margaret had begun making her way through the crowd with quick, purposeful steps, her earlier composure entirely abandoned, replaced by something closer to panic as she watched the evening she had so carefully orchestrated begin to unravel in ways she had never anticipated. She did not yet know how completely it would unravel before the night was through. Neither, in truth, did Alina, who stood at the center of the ballroom floor with her hand still resting in the Duke's, watching his expression shift from curiosity into something that looked, unmistakably, like the dawning of a memory he had carried, unresolved, for the better part of 5 years. The final notes of the waltz faded into a warm ripple of applause from the surrounding guests, though Alina barely heard it, her attention entirely fixed on the strange, unreadable expression that had settled over the Duke's face. He did not release her hand as the music ended, nor did he step back to offer the customary bow that would end their dance. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, as though trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle that had, until that very moment, refused to form a complete picture. "Whitmore," he said again, softly, almost to himself. "Edmund Whitmore the merchant." "You knew my father?" Alina asked, her heart beginning to beat faster for reasons she could not yet name. "I believe I owe him my life," Alexander said quietly, and the simple gravity of the statement seemed to still the air between them. Alina's lips parted slightly in surprise. "I do not understand." Alexander glanced briefly around the crowded ballroom, aware, even in the midst of his own astonishment, of the many curious eyes still fixed upon them. "Perhaps this is not the place for such a conversation," he said. "Will you walk with me?" Alina hesitated only a moment before nodding, and Alexander offered his arm, guiding her carefully through the parting crowd toward a set of tall doors that led out onto a stone terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens below. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the heat and noise of the ballroom, and Alina felt some of the tension finally begin to loosen in her shoulders as the doors closed behind them, muffling the music and chatter into a distant hum. They walked in silence for a few moments along the terrace, the gravel garden spreading out below them in the pale wash of moonlight, before Alexander finally spoke again. "5 years ago," he began, "I was returning home late one winter evening along the old road that runs past Millbrook. The night was bitterly cold, and there had been rain earlier that had frozen over the stones by the time I passed through. My carriage struck a patch of ice on a steep bend and overturned." Alina listened, a strange, tightening sensation building in her chest, though she could not yet say why. "I remember very little of the accident itself," Alexander continued. "Only the sound and then the terrible weightlessness of the carriage rolling. When I came to my senses, I was pinned beneath part of the wreckage, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, that I was going to die there on that road, alone in the dark." "But you did not," Alina said softly. "No," Alexander said, "because a stranger stopped. A merchant traveling the same road, on his way home from some business dealing further north. He pulled me free from the wreckage with his own hands, at no small risk to himself, for the carriage was still unstable and might have shifted further at any moment. He stayed with me until I was steady enough to stand, made certain no bones were broken, and when my own household's men finally arrived, summoned by a passing farmer, he simply melted away into the darkness before I could properly thank him." Alina's breath had gone shallow, her hand tightening slightly around the stone balustrade beside her. "I asked him his name," Alexander continued, his voice growing quieter, more reflective. "He would not give it. He said only that he wanted nothing in return, no reward, no recognition. I remember his exact words, because I have carried them with me every day since. He told me, 'Be kind to those the world overlooks, and consider your debt paid in full.'" Alina felt tears rise sharply behind her eyes, unbidden and impossible to hold back this time. "That sounds," she said, her voice unsteady, "exactly like something my father would say." "I searched for him for years," Alexander said. "I sent inquiries to every town along that road, asking after a merchant who had helped a stranger in a carriage accident that winter. I never received a single answer that led anywhere. I had nearly given up hope of ever learning his name, or of ever properly thanking the man who saved my life. He never spoke of it, Elinor said quietly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Not once in all the years after, I never knew. That does not surprise me, Alexander said, if he was anything like the man who pulled me from that wreckage. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the distant music from the ballroom drifting faintly through the doors behind them, the cool night air settling gently around them both. Elinor found herself studying the Duke's face in the moonlight, searching for some trace of the desperate, frightened young man he must once have been, pinned beneath the weight of an overturned carriage on a dark and freezing road, saved by a kindness that asked nothing in return. "There is something else," Alexander said finally, nodding toward the brooch still pinned above her heart. "That piece. I believe I recognize it." Elinor's hand rose instinctively to touch it once more. "My mother left it to me before she died. I have always known only that it was hers." "My own mother had a companion many years ago," Alexander said slowly, memory clearly surfacing as he spoke. "A young woman named Catherine who served her for several years before leaving to marry. My mother spoke of her often with great fondness long after she had gone. She had a brooch very much like that one, a gift my mother gave her upon her marriage, in the shape of a small silver bird. I remember it clearly because my mother kept its twin, a matching piece, in her own jewelry box until the day she died." Elinor's breath caught entirely. "My mother's name was Catherine," she whispered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the revelation settling slowly between them. Two threads of the past drawing together across 5 years and countless miles of searching, meeting finally on a moonlit terrace neither of them had expected to stand upon that evening. "It seems," Alexander said at last, a note of quiet wonder entering his voice, "that I have been searching for your family far longer than I realized, and in far more ways than one." Elinor did not know what to say. The evening had begun in humiliation, wine soaking into the hem of a dress she had never wanted to wear, laughter ringing in her ears from every corner of the ballroom. And now, somehow, she stood on a quiet terrace beneath the stars, discovering that the man who had rescued her from that humiliation was bound to her by threads reaching back through both of her parents, threads she had never known existed. "I have spent years wondering how I might ever repay the debt I owe your father," Alexander said, turning to face her fully now, his expression earnest in a way that made Elinor's heart ache with something she could not yet name. "I never imagined the opportunity might come in the form of his daughter, standing before me tonight." "You owe me nothing, your grace," Elinor said quietly. "Whatever kindness passed between you and my father, it was given freely without expectation. He would not wish it repaid through me." "Perhaps not," Alexander agreed. "But I find tonight that I am not thinking of repayment at all." Something in his tone made Elinor look up sharply, meeting his eyes in the pale moonlight, and what she saw there was neither pity nor obligation, but something far warmer, something that made her pulse quicken in a way entirely unrelated to the shock of the evening's revelations. Before either of them could speak further, the terrace doors swung open behind them, and Margaret's voice cut sharply through the quiet night air, brittle with barely controlled panic. "Elinor," she called, her tone attempting warmth and failing entirely. "There you are. Your Grace, I do apologize. My stepdaughter is not accustomed to society. I hope she has not troubled you with—" "On the contrary," Alexander said, turning to face Margaret with a composure that gave away nothing of the conversation he had just shared. "Your stepdaughter has done nothing but honor this evening, Lady Whitmore. I find myself deeply in her family's debt, in ways I suspect you do not fully appreciate." Margaret's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing her carefully composed features for the first time that evening. "I am certain I do not understand your meaning, your Grace." "Perhaps not yet," Alexander said, and there was something in his tone, quiet but unmistakably firm, that made Margaret's confidence waver visibly. "But I suspect you soon will." Alina watched the exchange with a strange, unfamiliar sensation building steadily in her chest, something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. For the first time since her father's death, she did not feel small or overlooked or afraid. She felt, standing there on that moonlit terrace with the Duke of Ashford at her side and her mother's brooch warm against her heart, as though the world had finally begun, however slowly, to turn back in her favor. She did not yet know how much further that turn would carry her before the night was through, nor how completely the careful cruelty Margaret had spent years constructing was about to come undone, exposed not through revenge or design, but simply through the quiet, unstoppable arrival of truth. Margaret recovered her composure with visible effort, smoothing the front of her gown and forcing her smile back into place, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed how badly the Duke's words had unsettled her. "Your Grace is too kind," she said, her voice pitched carefully bright. "But I really must insist Alina return inside. The night air is cold and she is not accustomed to such fine company. I would not want her to feel out of her depth." "I assure you," Alexander said evenly, "she has managed remarkably well thus far, given the circumstances." The pointed edge beneath his politeness was unmistakable, and Margaret's smile flickered again, though she pressed on regardless. "Circumstances, Your Grace." "The wine," Alexander said simply, "and the laughter that followed it. I confess I found the entire display rather curious, given how carefully it seemed to have been arranged." Margaret's face paled slightly beneath her powder. "I am certain I do not know what you mean." "My daughter's spill was a simple accident, nothing more." "Perhaps," Alexander said, his tone giving nothing away. "Though I have found in my experience that accidents rarely require quite so attentive an audience to appreciate them fully." Alina watched the exchange with a growing, cautious sense of vindication, though she said nothing herself, content for the moment to let the Duke's careful words do the work she had spent 2 years too exhausted and too afraid to attempt on her own. Margaret, for her part, seemed to sense the ground shifting beneath her, her usual confidence faltering visibly under the weight of the Duke's calm, unwavering attention. "If you will excuse us, Your Grace," Margaret said finally, reaching for Alina's arm, "I really must see to my daughters. It has been a long evening." "Of course," Alexander said, though he did not step aside immediately. Instead, he turned to Alina, his expression softening considerably as he addressed her directly. "Might I call upon you tomorrow, Miss Whitmore? I find there is a great deal more I would like to discuss, regarding your father, and regarding matters that I believe concern your welfare directly." Alina glanced briefly at Margaret, whose grip on her arm had tightened almost imperceptibly, before meeting the Duke's eyes again. "I would welcome that, Your Grace," she said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. The following days passed in a strange, suspended quality Alina could not fully explain, as though the ordinary rhythms of the household had shifted slightly out of true. Margaret said little about the ball in the days that followed, though Alina noticed her stepmother watching her with new and careful attention, as though reassessing a piece on a chessboard whose value she had previously misjudged. True to his word, the Duke called upon Corin Lane 2 days after the ball, arriving not alone but accompanied by his family's solicitor, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Hartley, who carried a leather case of papers beneath his arm. Margaret received them in the parlor with visibly strained hospitality, ordering tea and attempting, without much success, to steer the conversation toward pleasantries. "I am afraid this is not entirely a social call," Alexander said, once the tea had been poured and the initial courtesies exchanged. "Mr. Hartley has been assisting me with a matter I believe concerns this household directly, regarding the terms of Edmund Whitmore's estate." Margaret's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "I do not see what business that could be of yours, Your Grace." "Perhaps none at all, ordinarily," Alexander said. "But given the debt I owe the late Mr. Whitmore, I felt compelled to look further into his affairs, and what Mr. Hartley discovered troubled me considerably." Mr. Hartley opened his leather case and drew out a set of documents, spreading them carefully across the low table between them. Mr. Whitmore's will, he explained, clearly stipulates that his daughter, Alina, was to inherit a sum of £8,000 upon reaching her majority, held in trust until that time. She turned 19 this past spring. Alina, seated quietly beside the window, felt her breath catch sharply. She had known, vaguely, that her father left some provision for her in his will, but Margaret had always been evasive on the subject, insisting the estate's finances were complicated and best left to her management. "I am certain there is some misunderstanding," Margaret said quickly, setting down her teacup with a hand that was not quite steady. "The estate's affairs have been managed entirely properly, I assure you." "Then you will have no objection," Mr. Hartley said mildly, "to the trust's records being reviewed by an independent solicitor to confirm the funds remain intact." Margaret's composure cracked visibly for the first time, a flush of genuine alarm spreading across her features before she could smooth it away. "This is entirely unnecessary," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I have managed this household's finances faithfully since my husband's death, under considerable strain, I might add, with 3 daughters to provide for." "3 daughters," Alexander repeated quietly. "Though I understand only 2 of them have received the benefit of that provision, in the form of new gowns, dancing lessons, and the considerable expenses of tonight's ball preparations. Miss Alina, meanwhile, was provided with a single dress deliberately altered to invite ridicule, and has, by the account of your own household staff, performed the duties typically assigned to servants for the past 2 years. Margaret's face had gone entirely white. "You have spoken to my staff." "Mr. Hartley took the liberty of making some discreet inquiries," Alexander said. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but given the circumstances, I felt it necessary." Alina sat very still throughout the exchange, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the careful, practiced mask Margaret had worn for 2 years finally begin to slip away entirely, revealing beneath it something far less composed, something closer to desperation. She felt no particular satisfaction in the sight, only a quiet, settling sense of long-delayed vindication, as though a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten its shape was finally, slowly, being lifted from her shoulders. "Whatever funds were spent," Margaret said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "were spent in the reasonable maintenance of this household, which includes Alina's own upkeep, her food, her lodging in the smallest room at the top of the house," Alexander said, "while her stepsisters occupy the finest rooms available. Her food, prepared largely by her own hands, given that the household staff report she has performed the majority of the cooking and cleaning for the better part of 2 years. I do not believe any reasonable accounting would find £8,000 spent on such modest provisions, Lady Whitmore." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, broken only by the faint ticking of the parlor clock, and the distant sound of Cordelia and Beatrice's voices drifting down from somewhere upstairs, unaware of the conversation unfolding below them. "What do you intend to do?" Margaret asked finally, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "That," Alexander said, "is a matter for Mr. Hartley and the proper authorities to determine, based on what the full accounting reveals. But I would say this, Lady Whitmore. Whatever consequences follow from your management of Alina's inheritance, they will not come from any desire of mine for vengeance. They will come simply from the truth being allowed, finally, to surface." Alina watched her stepmother's face crumple slightly, the careful composure she had maintained for 2 years finally giving way entirely, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no particular triumph in the sight. She felt, instead, a strange and unexpected sorrow, for the years of quiet cruelty that had never needed to happen, for the family that might have been, had Margaret chosen kindness instead of resentment from the very beginning. But sorrow, she was beginning to understand, did not require her to accept injustice in its place. She could grieve what might have been while still allowing the truth, at last, to set things right. Mr. Hartley began gathering the accounting documents that would, over the following weeks, be reviewed in careful detail, uncovering the full extent of the funds Margaret had quietly redirected from Alina's trust over the preceding 2 years. funds that had paid for silk gowns and piano lessons, and 100 small luxuries Alina had never been permitted to share. It was not, in the end, a story of dramatic confrontation or public disgrace, though word would inevitably spread through society circles in the weeks that followed. It was, instead, a slow and careful unwinding of truth from deception, conducted with the same quiet, deliberate patience the Duke had shown from the very first moment he crossed that ballroom floor toward a young woman the rest of the room had chosen only to laugh at. Alina watched it unfold from her seat by the window, her mother's brooch still pinned above her heart, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the world had finally begun to make room for the truth of who she was, rather than the smaller, quieter version of herself she had been forced to become. The weeks that followed brought changes to Corin Lane more sweeping than any Alina could have imagined possible only a month before. Mr. Hartley's full accounting, completed after careful review of the trust's records and testimony from the household staff, confirmed what had by then become plain to everyone involved. Nearly the entirety of Alina's inheritance had been quietly diverted over the preceding 2 years toward the maintenance and advancement of Margaret's own daughters, leaving only a small remainder in the trust that should, by law, have belonged to Alina alone. The matter was resolved, in the end, without the public spectacle Alina had half feared. Margaret, faced with the clear evidence Mr. Hartley presented, chose to avoid the far greater scandal of a formal legal proceeding by agreeing to a private settlement, restoring what funds remained available and signing over certain smaller properties her late husband had left in trust for Alina's benefit. It was not, in the end, the full sum Edmund Whitmore had intended for his daughter, much of it having already been spent beyond any hope of recovery, but it was enough, combined with the properties, to grant Alina a genuine and lasting independence for the first time in her adult life. Society, as society tends to do, learned of the matter regardless of the private nature of its resolution. Whispers traveled quickly through the drawing rooms and dinner parties of the city, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until the story of the cruel stepmother and the humiliated stepdaughter rescued by the Duke of Ashford had become, within a matter of weeks, one of the season's most discussed scandals. Margaret found herself, almost overnight, transformed from a respected widow of modest standing into a figure of quiet disgrace, her invitations dwindling, her carefully cultivated friendships cooling with polite but unmistakable distance. Alina took no pleasure in her stepmother's fall from favor, though she would not pretend, even to herself, that she felt nothing at all. Mostly what she felt, in the quiet weeks that followed, was a kind of exhausted relief, as though she had finally set down a burden she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Cordelia and Beatrice, for their part, found their own marriage prospects considerably diminished by the scandal attached to their family name, a fact that seemed to trouble them far more than any concern for the sister they had spent years mistreating. Alina encountered Cordelia only once in the weeks that followed, in a chance meeting at a dressmaker's shop, and found the encounter stranger than she had expected, her stepsister's usual confidence replaced by a brittle, uncertain politeness that bordered on apology, though no actual apology was ever offered. Alina did not linger on the encounter. She had, by then, more pressing matters occupying her thoughts and her time. With her inheritance restored, however incompletely, Alina made the decision, with Mr. Hartley's careful guidance, to take a small house of her own in a quiet, respectable part of the city, modest but entirely hers, purchased with funds that belonged to her alone and answerable to no one else's whims. Lady Prescott, the kind-eyed woman she had met so briefly at the ball, proved an unexpected and steady friend throughout the transition, helping her navigate the practical details of establishing an independent household and offering, more valuably still, genuine warmth and companionship of a kind Alina had not experienced since her father's death. "You have more courage than you credit yourself with," Lady Prescott told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the small, sunlit parlor of Alina's new home, arranging fresh flowers in a simple glass vase. Most young women, faced with what you endured, would have folded entirely. You did not. I very nearly did, Alina admitted. There were evenings I thought I had nothing left to hold myself together with. And yet here you are, Lady Prescott said gently, holding yourself together quite admirably, I would say. Alina found herself smiling at that, a small, genuine smile that came more easily now than it had in years. She was beginning, slowly, to remember what it felt like to simply be herself, without the constant vigilance of a household determined to diminish her. The Duke called upon her regularly throughout those weeks, though always with careful propriety, never overstepping the bounds of proper courtship despite the unusual circumstances that had first brought them together. Their conversations at first centered largely on practical matters, the settlement of her inheritance, the details of establishing her new household, gradually broadened into something warmer and more personal. Long afternoons spent walking through the small garden behind her new house, discussing everything from her father's business ventures to the running of the Ashford estate, from her childhood memories of her mother to his own struggles with the weight of his title. "I confess," Alexander told her one afternoon, as they walked slowly along a gravel path lined with late summer roses, "that I had grown quite weary of society before that ball. I expected another tedious evening of practiced smiles and rehearsed conversation. And instead you found a woman drenched in wine, being laughed at by half the room," Alina said, a touch of dry humor entering her voice that would have been unthinkable only months before. "Instead," Alexander corrected gently, "I found the one person in that entire glittering room who was not performing anything at all. You stood there, humiliated and furious and frightened, and you did not pretend otherwise, not even for a moment. I do not believe I have ever admired anyone so immediately, or so completely." Alina felt the familiar warmth rise in her cheeks, though it carried none of the old shame she had once associated with such attention, only a quiet, growing happiness she was still learning to trust. "I nearly did not attend, you know. I very nearly stayed home, rather than face what I feared would happen." "I am deeply grateful you did not," Alexander said, stopping along the path to face her fully, his expression suddenly more serious than the light conversation had suggested. "I have thought often, in the weeks since, about what might never have happened had you made that other choice. I do not like to imagine it." Alina met his eyes steadily, feeling the weight and warmth of the moment settle around them both. "Nor do I, your grace." "Alexander," he corrected softly, "I think, after everything, you might allow yourself that much." "Alexander," she repeated, testing the name, finding it settled comfortably on her tongue in a way that felt somehow like coming home. Not every part of that season passed without difficulty. A distant cousin of Edmund Whitmore's, a man named Gerald Whitmore whom Alina had met only once as a child, emerged in early autumn with a claim against the estate, insisting that certain provisions of Edmund's will had been improperly drafted, and that a portion of the inheritance rightfully belonged to him as the nearest surviving male relative. The claim threatened, for a tense and uncertain fortnight, to unravel the careful settlement Mr. Hartley had negotiated, dragging Alina into precisely the kind of public legal proceedings she had hoped to avoid. Alexander stood beside her throughout the ordeal, insisting on covering the cost of the finest solicitor available to review the original will and confirm its proper execution, though Alina, in her newfound independence, insisted on repaying every shilling once the matter was resolved. The claim, in the end, was dismissed after Mr. Hartley produced clear documentation proving Edmund Whitmore had properly witnessed and registered his will years before his death, leaving no legal ground for the challenge to stand upon. Gerald Whitmore withdrew his claim quietly, without further contest, and Alina felt, watching the matter finally close, a fierce and unfamiliar satisfaction in having stood her ground rather than simply yielding, as she might once have done, to avoid conflict. "You did not need my help with that one in the end," Alexander observed afterward, as they sat together in the small parlor of her house, the autumn light slanting warm through the windows. "You had already gathered half the necessary documents yourself before Mr. Hartley even arrived." I have had a great deal of practice, this past year, learning to fight for what is mine, Elinor said. I do not intend to stop simply because the fighting has grown easier. Alexander regarded her for a long moment, something warm and unmistakably admiring in his expression. I would not want you to, he said quietly. I think it is precisely that fire I first admired in you, standing in that ballroom with wine on your dress, and your chin held higher than anyone else in the room. Elinor smiled, the last lingering shadow of that humiliating evening finally dissolving entirely into something she could look back upon with something close to gratitude. For it had been, however painfully, the beginning of everything that followed. As autumn deepened into winter, their courtship continued to grow, steady and unhurried, built not upon the sudden drama of a single evening but upon the quieter, more lasting foundation of shared history, mutual respect, and a growing tenderness neither of them troubled to hide any longer. Elinor found herself, for the first time since her father's death, genuinely happy, not merely surviving the days as they came, but looking forward to them, each one bringing her closer to a future she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. She did not yet know. On the crisp winter afternoon Alexander asked her to walk with him through the gardens of Ashford Hall itself, exactly what waited for her at the end of that particular path. But she walked it all the same, her hand resting easily in the crook of his arm, her mother's brooch pinned, as always, above her heart, carrying her steadily forward into whatever came next. The gardens of Ashford Hall lay quiet beneath a light dusting of early snow, the bare branches of the rose bushes glittering faintly in the pale winter sunlight, the fountain at the garden center stilled for the season, its water long since drained to protect against the coming frost. Elinor walked beside Alexander along the familiar gravel path, her breath rising in small white clouds before her, her hand tucked warmly into the crook of his arm. They had walked this path together many times over the preceding months, through the last golden days of autumn and now into the crisp stillness of early winter, and Elinor had come to treasure these quiet, unhurried afternoons more than almost anything else in her new life. There was no performance required here, no careful maneuvering to avoid Margaret's sharp eyes or Cordelia's cutting remarks, only the simple comfort of Alexander's steady presence beside her. You have grown quiet, Alexander observed, glancing sideways at her as they approached the small stone bench near the frozen fountain. I was thinking of how different this winter feels from the last, Elinor admitted. A year ago I could not have imagined any of this. The house, the settlement, you. And how does it feel this year? Alexander asked, stopping beside the bench, though he made no move to sit. Like something I am still learning to trust, Elinor said honestly. I spent so long expecting each small happiness to be taken from me that I find myself, even now, half waiting for it to disappear. Alexander was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she had come to recognize over their months together, thoughtful and careful, as though weighing words before he allowed himself to speak them. I would like to offer you something, then, he said finally, that I hope might help you trust it a little more fully. Elinor watched, her breath catching slightly, as he reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small velvet box, worn slightly at the corners with age. He opened it carefully, revealing a ring set with a single, modest sapphire, far simpler than the grand jewels one might expect from a duke, but achingly beautiful in its quiet elegance. This belonged to my mother, Alexander said, his voice steadier than Elinor might have expected, though she could see, in the careful way he held himself, that the moment cost him something considerable in nerve. She wore it every day of her marriage until the day she died. I have kept it locked away for 5 years, uncertain whether I would ever find someone I trusted enough to offer it to. Elinor felt tears rise, sudden and unstoppable, blurring the winter garden around her into a soft haze of white and gray. I did not fall in love with you because of any debt I owed your father, Alexander continued, his eyes never leaving hers. I want you to understand that clearly, because I know the circumstances of how we met might make you wonder. I fell in love with you because you stood in that ballroom, humiliated in front of every person who mattered to society, and you did not break. Because in every conversation since, you have shown me a strength and a warmth I did not believe I would ever find in this life I was born into. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore, not for who your father was, but for who you have shown yourself to be. Alexander, Eleanor whispered, his name still new enough on her tongue to carry its own small thrill. Will you marry me? He asked simply, the winter air still and quiet around them, as though the entire garden had paused to hear her answer. Eleanor did not hesitate, though the moment felt in its own way as significant as any she had yet lived through. Yes, she said, the word coming out on a breath of laughter and tears together. Yes, I will. Alexander slid the ring onto her finger with careful, steady hands, and when he drew her close afterward, wrapping his arms around her in the quiet, snow-dusted garden, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest that she had not known. Until that very moment, she had been searching for her entire life. The simple, certain feeling of belonging somewhere to someone, without condition or cruelty attached. News of their engagement spread through society even more quickly than the scandal that had first brought them together, though this time the whispers carried admiration rather than mockery, a story too romantic for even the most jaded society matrons to resist repeating. Margaret, upon hearing the news, sent a brief and carefully worded letter of congratulations, the closest she had come, in all the months since the ball, to any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Eleanor read it once, folded it carefully, and set it aside, choosing neither to respond with anger nor to pretend the years of cruelty had never happened, but simply allowing herself, at last, to move forward without the weight of unresolved resentment holding her back. The wedding took place the following spring, in the small chapel attached to Ashford Hall, filled not with the glittering crowd of strangers who had once laughed at her, but with the smaller, warmer gathering of those who had genuinely come to know and care for her over the preceding months. Lady Prescott, beaming with quiet pride from the front pew. Mr. Hartley, formally invited despite his role as solicitor rather than friend, though the distinction had blurred considerably over the months of their acquaintance. A handful of household staff from Ashford Hall who had grown fond of the young woman their master had chosen. And, in a gesture that surprised Eleanor more than she expected, Cordelia and Beatrice, who arrived separately from their mother and sat quietly near the back. Watching with expressions Eleanor could not entirely read, though she thought she glimpsed something like genuine regret beneath their careful composure. Eleanor wore, for her wedding, a gown of pale ivory silk far finer than anything she had ever owned, commissioned by Alexander's own request from the same dressmaker who had once fitted Cordelia and Beatrice for the ball that changed everything. But pinned carefully above her heart, exactly where it had rested through every difficult and triumphant moment of the preceding year, was her mother's small silver brooch, its bird's wings catching the light streaming through the chapel's tall windows. "Dignity is not in what you wear," she whispered to herself as she walked down the aisle, her father's memory and her mother's words both carried with her in equal measure, but in how you carry it. She carried herself that day, exactly as she had learned to over the difficult months before it, with quiet strength, unshaken grace, and a heart finally free to feel joy without fear of its being taken away. As Alexander took her hands before the assembled gathering, his eyes bright with an emotion he made no effort to hide, Eleanor felt the last shadow of that humiliating evening in the Ashford ballroom dissolve entirely into something she could look back upon, at last, with nothing but gratitude. It had been, in the end, not the moment her world fell apart, but the moment it had finally, truly begun. The girl the world had once wanted to laugh at had become, in the eyes of everyone who mattered, a woman worthy of nothing less than admiration. And as she exchanged her vows in the soft spring light of that small chapel, Eleanor understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever challenges still lay ahead in the years to come, she would face them exactly as she had faced that ballroom full of laughter. With her chin held high, her mother's brooch resting warm above her heart, and her own quiet, unbreakable dignity carried steadily forward into every day that followed. 2 years passed, and Ashford Hall settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Alexander had quite expected when they first exchanged their vows in that small spring chapel. The great house, once known throughout the county for its quiet, dutiful formality, gradually filled with a warmth it had not held since Alexander's own mother was alive, laughter drifting more often through its long corridors, the kitchens busier with the comings and goings of guests who visited not out of social obligation but genuine affection. Alina never forgot the 2 years she had spent scrubbing floors and mending clothes by candlelight at Corin Lane, and rather than burying that memory as something shameful to be left behind, she chose instead to let it shape the household she now helped to run. She insisted, gently but firmly, that the staff at Ashford Hall be treated with a fairness and respect she herself had once been denied, learning each servant's name within her first month as mistress of the house, taking a genuine interest in their families and their well-being that surprised the older staff, accustomed as they were to a more distant relationship with the family they served. It was this same instinct, this quiet determination to notice the people others so easily overlooked, that led Alina, in the spring of her 2nd year of marriage, to establish a small charitable foundation dedicated to assisting young women left without adequate provision after the death of a parent, women exactly like the girl she had once been, dependent upon the goodwill of relatives who did not always extend it fairly. The foundation began modestly, funded from Alina's own restored inheritance and a generous contribution from Alexander, offering small grants and practical guidance to young women navigating inheritance disputes or unfair treatment within their own families. Word of it spread slowly at first, through quiet conversations among solicitors and clergy who encountered such cases in their own work, and then more quickly as the first young women it had helped began to speak of it themselves. Not everyone in society welcomed the venture with enthusiasm. Certain circles found it faintly scandalous for a duchess to concern herself so directly with matters of household disputes and financial grievances, work they considered beneath her new station. Among the foundation's most vocal critics was a woman named Priscilla Ashcombe, a wealthy widow with considerable influence among the city's most established families, who took every opportunity at social gatherings to suggest, with carefully veiled words, that Alina's charitable interests revealed a lingering vulgarity unbecoming of her title. "One does wonder," Priscilla remarked at a dinner party that spring, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the table, "whether her Grace's fondness for household disputes speaks to some lingering discomfort with her own rather unusual rise in station." The remark drew a ripple of uncertain laughter from several guests, the kind of laughter that tested the room before committing fully to either amusement or disapproval. Alina, seated near the head of the table, felt the old, familiar heat begin to rise in her cheeks, the same instinctive flush of shame she had once felt standing in the Ashford ballroom with wine soaking into her dress. But where once she might have shrunk beneath such a remark, she found now, after 2 years of steady, hard-won confidence, that she had no intention of retreating. "I confess I find it a curious thing to be criticized for," Alina said evenly, setting down her fork and meeting Priscilla's gaze directly across the table. "Helping young women who have been unfairly denied what is rightfully theirs seems to me a rather modest ambition, though perhaps I simply have not yet learned to share your enthusiasm for watching such injustices continue unchecked." The table fell briefly silent, several guests exchanging startled glances at the directness of the response. Priscilla's composed smile flickered, clearly unaccustomed to having her carefully aimed barbs returned so precisely. "I meant no offense, Your Grace," Priscilla said stiffly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Then I am certain none was taken," Alina replied smoothly, and the conversation moved on, though not before several guests at the table exchanged small, approving nods, and Alexander, seated beside her, reached beneath the table to give her hand a brief, proud squeeze. It was not the last such encounter Alina faced in those early years, for society, she was learning, did not surrender its old prejudices easily simply because one woman had risen above the circumstances it once used to mock her. But each time such a moment arose, she found herself meeting it with steadily growing ease, no longer the frightened young woman standing frozen beneath a spreading wine stain, but a duchess who had learned, through hard experience, exactly what her own dignity was worth and precisely how to defend it. The foundation, despite its critics, continued to grow. By the end of its second year, it had assisted more than 30 young women across the county, several of whom Alina came to know personally, inviting them to Ashford Hall for tea and quiet conversation, listening to their stories with the particular understanding of someone who had once stood exactly where they now stood. Among them was a girl named Charlotte Merrick, 17 years old, whose stepfamily had attempted to claim her late father's small shop for themselves, leaving her with nothing. Alina recognized in Charlotte's careful, guarded manner an echo of her own younger self, and took particular care in ensuring the girl's case received proper legal attention, ultimately securing her rightful inheritance, and more importantly, a genuine friendship that continued long after the legal matter was resolved. "You did not need to involve yourself so personally," Alexander observed one evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the library, Alina reviewing a stack of correspondence related to the Foundation's latest cases. "Mr. Hartley's associates could easily manage such matters without your direct attention." "I know," Alina said, setting down the letter she had been reading. "But I remember, very clearly, what it felt like to have no one notice, no one ask whether I was truly well cared for, no one willing to look past the surface of what my household appeared to be. I do not wish any other young woman to feel quite so invisible if I can help it." Alexander studied her for a long moment, the warm evening light from the fireplace catching the familiar gleam of the silver brooch she still wore, even now, pinned above her heart on most days, a habit she had never fully abandoned. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. "I think he would recognize in this foundation precisely the values he tried to teach you, even if you did not always see them clearly reflected in the household around you." "I like to think so," Alina said softly, a familiar ache of gratitude and grief mingling together, as it often did now when she thought of her father, no longer sharp with fresh loss but settled into something gentler, a quiet, permanent presence she carried with her rather than a wound she had to guard against. That autumn brought news that Margaret, whose social standing had never fully recovered from the scandal of the ball, had quietly left the city to live with a distant relative in the countryside, taking Beatrice with her, while Cordelia, somewhat unexpectedly, had accepted a modest but respectable marriage proposal from a widowed solicitor 12 years her senior, a match that would once have seemed beneath her ambitions but that she now pursued, by all accounts, with genuine contentment. Alina received the news without bitterness, feeling instead a quiet, settled peace at the thought that even those who had wronged her seemed, in their own imperfect ways, to be finding paths toward something steadier than the households they had once built on cruelty and comparison. She did not reach out to reconcile with Margaret, nor did she close the door entirely against the possibility of it happening someday, should Margaret ever offer the genuine apology she had never yet extended. Alina had learned, in the 2 years since that fateful ball, that forgiveness and reconciliation were not always the same thing, that she could release her own bitterness without inviting back into her life the very cruelty that had caused it in the first place. As winter approached once more, Alina stood at the tall windows of Ashford Hall's library, watching the first snow of the season begin to drift down over the quiet gardens below, the same gardens where Alexander had once asked her to marry him, where the fountain now stood still and silent beneath its winter cover. She thought, as she often did in such quiet moments, of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had once stood frozen in a crowded ballroom, wine soaking into the hem of a dress she had never wanted to wear, certain in that moment that the world had nothing kind left to offer her. That young woman, Alina thought, watching the snow fall softly over the grounds of the home she now called her own, could never have imagined the life that waited for her beyond that single, humiliating evening. She could not have known that the very cruelty designed to break her would instead become the moment that finally set her free, nor that the quiet dignity she had clung to so desperately in her darkest hour would prove, in the end, to be exactly the thing that carried her forward into everything good that followed. Alexander's hand found hers gently as he joined her at the window, and together they watched the snow continue to fall. Two people bound not merely by the debt of an old rescue on an icy road, nor by the accident of a ballroom encounter neither had planned, but by something steadier and far more lasting. A shared understanding that true worth was never found in silk gowns or grand titles, but in the quiet, unshakable dignity with which a person chose to carry themselves through both their hardest and their happiest days alike.